Dungeons and Dragons was changing rapidly in the late 1970s. Join me as I discuss the publication of the 1978 Players Handbook, which signaled the beginning of a separate and concurrent edition, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Today on Daddy Rolled a One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the differences in D&D editions, which is a sub-playlist of my series on the history of Dungeons & Dragons. Today we're going to be talking about Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, and very specifically the rules changes that were beginning to be proposed and published here in the 1978 release of the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Players Handbook. So this video, I'm going to mostly be focusing on the differences of the material presented in the Player's Handbook as compared to the stuff that had come out earlier. Particularly, I'm going to focus on the stuff from Men and Magic, Book 1 of the 3-book set of original Dungeons & Dragons, but I will also be touching on 3 of the supplements to original Dungeons & Dragons, 1975's Greyhawk and Blackmore supplements, 1 and 2, and 1976's Eldritch Wizardry. As well as occasionally I will be touching on some of the changes from Advanced Dungeons & Dragons versus Holmes Basic Dungeons & Dragons published in 1977. Now, I do have videos dedicated specifically to the changes from Holmes edition to original D&D, and I have separate videos each for these 3 supplements, Greyhawk, Blackmore, and Eldritch Wizardry. It's not necessary that you have watched those supplements before watching this video, but I would encourage you to, if you haven't seen them yet, to at least maybe go back and skim through them after you're finished with this, because a lot more detail is going to be presented in those videos on specific rules changes that I'm talking about that I'm probably just going to kind of lightly touch on or skip over here as I'm addressing how they're different from the Player's Handbook. Now, also, if you know a little bit about D&D's history, or if you've watched my videos before, you know that Advanced D&D, unlike current editions of Dungeons & Dragons like 3rd, 4th, and 5th, was released concurrently, not simultaneously. So the 3 core books, what we now call the 3 core books, were released over the course of 3 years. The Monster Manual in 1977, the Player's Handbook in 1978, and then the Dungeon Master's Guide in 1979. And so what's interesting is that nowadays, if you started with Dungeons & Dragons later, usually I'd say post 3rd edition, although even 2nd edition Advanced was kind of like this. The Player's Handbook typically has been known to feature the rules for the game. And then the Dungeon Master's Guide is really just more like advice or maybe some options and alternatives and things like that. Well, that wasn't the case in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, or what we call 1st edition. Gary Gygax very specifically, his approach to the game was that the players didn't really need to know, nor should they know, the rules. And in fact, in his introduction or foreword, whatever it was, of the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, he specifically states that players shouldn't know the rules and that they shouldn't read this. And if you're the Dungeon Master and find out that your players did read this, then you should penalize their characters in the game because their players have knowledge that they shouldn't have. And it's just a very different approach to the game. But things like combat, like how combat works, how turning undead works, how assassin characters can assassinate people or spy on people, or how thief skills work, that's all explained in here. And it wasn't intended for the players. Now, there's some of that is lightly touched on here, like it discusses the skills that a thief has and tells you what they are. But the implementation of the rules, how they are interpreted in the game, that's in here. Now, some people think that a lot of the information that is in here that seems like it should have been in here is because these books, again, were published roughly a year apart. And a lot of what Gary wrote in here, people say, was responses to questions that people had regarding what wasn't discussed in the Player's Handbook and how did it work. And so that's how this material came to be in these 2 separate books. But again, from a very largely standpoint, Gary felt that the players didn't need access to the rules. Another example of that And we'll get to it a little bit later, but just so you can kind of see where Gary's mindset is coming from, is talking about hit points. And he says that you don't have to play it this way, but one way that a dungeon master can approach hit points is that the players actually don't know how many they have left. So the player knows how many they're starting with, but during a combat, the DM is rolling the damage and he's not rolling it in front of the players. He's rolling it behind a screen. And then he's telling the players, oh, you feel tired or you feel weak or things like that. He's using adjectives to describe how the players feel rather than telling them you lost 8 hit points or you lost 15 hit points or whatever it is. So the player actually doesn't know until it's almost too late how many hit points they have left. And that was a valid way of playing in Gary's mind. And I know a lot of players would really not like that. And, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's more just, again, giving you a peek into Gary's mindset as to how he thought the game could be run. Okay, so we have talked a little bit about the first book in the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 3 core book series, which is the Monster Manual from 1977. So I have a video on that and discussing how the monsters in this book were presented differently from the monsters in Monsters and Treasure Book 2 here, as well as a little bit of differences from their depiction in the Holmes Basic set. So again, though, the difficulty is this is the first book with the Advanced D&D tag to alert you that this is a different game in theory than this. But there's no rules in here. So other than the rules for running these monsters, but you had no system to use this book. So people use this with either this game here or with Holmes Basic or sometimes both. And again, just as a reminder for people that don't really know, Holmes Basic was written or edited, I should say, by Professor Holmes as a way to streamline and condense and be an explanation to new players to the game who don't have a background in wargaming, how to play Dungeons and Dragons, because this game, these 3 books here, were really not great at teaching you how to play. They were more almost presented as like notes for people that were already playing the game, like just to keep things consistent in a way. And so the Holmes Basic set 1977 was written initially to revise the presentation for sure, not really changing the rules. That wasn't the intent. The intent was to make it easier to understand for a new player, again, without a wargaming background, to know how to play Dungeons and Dragons. But what happens is this gets changed later on to end up being revised to be an introduction to Advanced D&D before Advanced D&D exists. So you have rules changes in here, some of which are very compatible with original, but then other things that tell you to refer to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons for other things. So it's kind of this outlier as far as an addition, because it was changed as it was being edited or written from its original goal. And it's not always consistent. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later on. Okay, but this doesn't have any rules. This is the first book, then, the Players Handbook, 1978, that really starts to focus on how the game is going to be played. And specifically, this is obviously going to be information for creating player characters. So what I'm going to do is focus mostly on creating the characters. So generating ability scores and what those ability scores are, what they mean, and how they're implemented in the game. And again, pointing out the differences versus the prior editions of the game, original and Holmes. And then also a little bit about the races. This game uses the term race, not species, which species is now, I think, in the 2024 edition. I don't know. I don't have it, but that's what I've heard. They use the term race here, and basically they're referring to humans, and then what at the time they called demi-humans, which is basically any player character race that you're allowed to play that wasn't human. They were called demi-humans. So that's going to be your standard dwarves, elves, halflings, half-orcs, and gnomes. And then a little bit about the classes. So there's a lot of classes in here. I'm going to talk about what's new in this book or how it's presented differently, but the main classes that I'm going to focus on as far as how they're different are going to be the original 3 classes, which is cleric, fighter, and magic user, and talk about how their presentation in here is different than it was in original Dungeons and Dragons. And then a little bit about things like equipment and alignment and weapons and armor and spells, magic, and then we'll kind of finish off with the appendices in the back. So that's going to really be the focus. So you'll notice that I'm really not going to talk too much about things like combat and dungeon procedures and all of that kind of stuff, because again, that stuff is in this book, and I just decided it was too much for this video. So there are going to be 3 videos talking about the differences of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and this is the second of the 3, and then the third one will be the Dungeon Master's Guide and the rules that are in here. I just felt it was easier to split it up that way. Okay, but as you're watching this, if content like this about the history of D&D or the differences in different editions and things like that, if that's content that you enjoy, then please remember to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit the bell icon so you'll be notified when I upload new videos like this one. Also, if you could, please share the video and leave a comment below, because those are things that really are important to the YouTube algorithm. And if you do it within the first hour of the video being posted, it's a huge help to small channels like mine. All right, so let's get into the Player's Handbook and talk about, what's in here. And, I have talked a little bit about the Player's Handbook before, but you can see just here from the contents what kind of stuff we're going to be talking about. So the game, creating player characters, abilities, races, classes, alignment, hit points, establishing the characters, languages, money, equipping the characters, armor, weapons, hirelings, henchmen, time, distance, monsters, the term, character spells and spell tables, spell explanations, spell casting, a little bit about the adventure. Okay, and then you see there's encumbrance, movement, light, infravision, ultravision, silent movement, invisible movement, surprise, traps, tricks, encounters, initiative, communication, negotiation, combat, and combat procedures. It says procedures. That's very generous, especially when you look at how many pages it takes up, which is less than 1. All of these combat procedures are basically like a paragraph each, because it's giving you a flavor of like, this is what this means, but not how it's done. And then damage. And then you get experience, poison, which I always thought was just so funny. It just comes out of nowhere, poison. And then successful adventures, and then you get your appendices here, okay? So again, I'm going to really focus on, for this video, mostly this stuff here. So this is going to be abilities, races, and classes. And then again, on the alignment and equipment and weapons and then spells. That's going to be the bulk of this, but I will touch on some of the other subjects, okay? So what's really going to be different in this, you're going to see it right away, partly in the presentation of the rules, but this is going to be our section on character abilities and creating the character. And so it's going to say each participant in the campaign created by the referee must create 1 or more game personas. So Gary used to use that word persona a lot. He means player character, okay, but he calls it a persona. The game persona of each participant is called the player character in order to differentiate it from the personas created by the referee, which are called non-player characters. All right, and then it gives you an explanation of the term level. Those aren't really rules, that's just an explanation. Okay, now we get to character abilities. Each and every character has 6 principal characteristics, the character's abilities. These are strength, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity, constitution, and charisma. Those are the exact same we see in the original game and the exact same 6 that we have all the way now in the most recent edition of 2024 Dungeons and Dragons, like 5th edition revised or whatever you want to call it. Okay, and then it says the range of these abilities is between 3 and 18. The premise of the game is that each player character is above average, at least in some respects, and has superior potential. Furthermore, it is usually essential to the character's survival to be exceptional with a rating of 15 or above and no fewer than 2 ability characteristics. Now, that is a difference, because remember, in original Dungeons and Dragons, as we've talked about it before, your ability scores, for the most part, did nothing other than give you either a bonus or a penalty to your experience points, depending on whether it was a prime requisite. So fighter's prime requisite was strength, and if you had a higher strength, you got more bonus experience points when experience points were calculated. And if you had a low strength, you could still be a fighter and it didn't affect you whatsoever. You could have a strength 3 fighter, and the only difference it made to you was that you gained fewer experience points. You took a penalty to the experience points that you earned. Now, later when Greyhawk comes out, Gary is going to put a table in here in Greyhawk Supplement 1 where he talks about, well, if a fighter, and it's only for fighters, if they have a higher strength, they also can get bonus to their chance to hit and to damage. And then he's going to talk about things like how much weight you can carry and what your chances to open a door on a 1d6 roll. So a higher strength, you open a door on a 1 to 5 on a d6, whereas if you have a strength 3, you only open a door on a 1 on a 1d6. Okay, so, but it's only for fighters. Okay, but other than that, ability scores really didn't do that much. There's a little bit of a change for Constitution where it talks about maybe giving some bonus hit points or penalties depending on whether it's high or low. And it talks about for dexterity, it can affect your ability to hit and do missile damage and things like that. But which are things that we expect, but it's very kind of hit or miss, and most of it is coming from a supplement. It's not in the original game. Okay, so he also delves into things like intelligence in Greyhawk. He talks about, well, it can affect your chance to know a given spell and how many spells you know per level, your minimum and your maximum. But again, that's coming in a supplement. It's presented as it's additional rules. But a lot of people didn't use these supplements. They only played the original game. And so with that being said, the point of that is that if you had a high ability score, it really didn't make much of a difference. But here, Gary's telling you should have no fewer than 2 that have a 15 or higher score. And he says each ability score is determined by random number generation. The referee has several methods of how this random number generation should be accomplished, suggested to him or her in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So as a player, you can't actually make a character with this book because you don't know how you're supposed to generate that 3 to 18 number. All that's going to be presented in this book, which remember is coming out a year later, 1978 for the Player's Handbook. This is a full year later. So while I say that this starts to present the rules, it's talking about like how to create a character, but not giving you all of the information. So he didn't think players needed to know how to roll that. That's in the Dungeon Master's purview. And that's because there are several different methods for creating characters in here and for rolling those, those ability scores. And Gary was leaving it up to the Dungeon Master to pick which one the Dungeon Master wanted to use. So I think if memory serves, and we'll get to this when we finally get to that video, but I think the default here, method 1, was roll 46, discard 1, and then, discard the lowest and then assign as you want. Whereas remember in here, the wording is a little clumsy, but the implication is that you're rolling, and it's actually not you, it's the Dungeon Master is rolling 3d6 in order and assigning the scores. So the first one you're rolling is strength. The second one you're rolling is intelligence. So as the player character, you're going to be handed a list of 6 scores in order that they were rolled. And then you're going to look at it and decide which character you want to play. And again, you don't have to play to your strengths. Just know that you'll probably not get as many bonus experience points if you don't pick a character that matches your highest ability score. So very, very different in here. This is changing it a little bit. Okay. And so then he's going to go on to explain what all these abilities mean. Now, they mean the same thing. Obviously, strength means the same thing in all these editions. But what strength does is very different. So now you see here, and this is going to be new. This is new in Advanced D&D. This is the first time where you're going to start seeing that your ability scores, what you roll, is going to determine what race and class you can or can't be. So if you roll a strength of 5 or lower, it's telling you that you can only be a magic user. That's your only choice. And if you roll a strength of 5 or lower as well, you can't be a gnome, half-orc, or halfling because they have a minimum strength of 6. And dwarves have a minimum strength of 8. And fighters have a minimum strength of 9. Now, this is brand new. Okay. The idea that the core classes, cleric, fighter, magic user, and then later you could consider thief core presented in Greyhawk Supplement 1. They did not have minimum ability scores. Some of the alternative classes that were proposed, so paladin, monks, assassins, and druids that are presented throughout Greyhawk, these supplements here, Greyhawk, Blackmoor, and Eldritch Wizardry, all of those, which are subclasses to the main classes, all of those have ability score minimums that will tell you. So if you were a fighter and you had been a lawful alignment and you had a charisma of 17 or higher, you could qualify to be a paladin. And, monks had different ability score minimums, as did, like I said, assassins and druids. Okay. So those are different, but fighter, magic user, and cleric did not have that. But now you do. So now it's telling you that if you want to be a fighter, you have to have a strength of 9 or higher. And then you see this table just keeps going on and on. So minimum strength for assassins and paladins, minimum strength for rangers, maximum strength for a female halfling character was 14. Maximum for a female gnome character, but minimum for a monk is 15. Okay, and then, on and on and on. Okay, so you see all these differences here. And then you see this table that shows you your ability adjustments to hit and damage, and then the weight allowance of what you're able to carry, opening doors on A, and then again, this is on a D6. It doesn't tell you that, but that's what that is. So you're rolling a D6, and if you roll a 1 at ability score 3 strength, you're going to open the door. But if you have an 18, again, you're going to open here. He's changed the table from Greyhawk, but now it's a 1 to 3. And then Ben Barr's lift gates is not on a D6. That's on a percentage. Why? Who knows? So that's another thing that's very common in these early editions of D&D. It doesn't start with AD&D, but AD&D definitely doubles down on this idea that there is no core mechanic. Sometimes you're rolling a D20 to do things. Sometimes you're rolling percentile dice to do things. And sometimes you're rolling a D6. Sometimes it might be something else. It could be 2d6. It could be a variety of different things. But the main 3 things you're doing is a d20, a d6, or d percentiles. The thing that's interesting is that all those are probabilities. That's all they are. So the idea that he chose different types of dice to use, I've talked a lot about this before, but partly Gary just liked different dice. Okay, partly this is rooted in war games where certain actions were determined by certain things. And as Gary is creating new things to do, he's creating new systems, not necessarily just using the same old systems. There's a variety of different reasons. To us now, I think, or not to us, not necessarily to me, because I started with this. So I think to a lot of new gamers, they don't understand this idea of non-core mechanics, and they want the idea of just rolling a single D20 to determine all the actions. That was a huge thing when 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons came out, that all these different things that had all these different subsystems were all condensed into a single D20 roll. And a lot of people really, really liked that. And a lot of people really, really hated it. So I really don't think it makes too much of a difference. It's easier to remember in one case because you don't have to remember what kind of die you're rolling. But on the flip side, rolling dice is fun. And sometimes I think it is cool to have different mechanics for different kinds of things because it helps you know what's in the purview of different types of characters. So, and I've talked all about that before in previous videos. Okay, but what you're seeing though here is that this table where it's talking about hit probability and damage adjustment and stuff. So when it's presented in Greyhawk, that's presented as that's for fighters only. This is applying to everybody, which is how we're used to it now. This idea that your strength impacts your ability during combat. And it doesn't matter if you're a fighter or not, because sooner or later, everyone's going to be in combat. Okay, now the other thing that we're going to see here is that these numbers don't match up. So the hit probability is different than the damage adjustment. And also that the spread of numbers is not consistent of what you'd see like again in a 3rd or 5th edition game where it's every 2 points gives you a +1, right? So 10 and 11 is a 0. And then as you go 2 points below 10 and 11, that's a -1 to each. And then as you go 2 points above 10 and 11, you get +1 to each. This spread is very, very different. So hit probability starts at -3 for a 3 ability score. Then it goes to -2, -1 at 6 to 7. And then it's normal, no penalty or bonus for a score of 8 all the way through a score of 16. Okay, and then at 17, you get +1 to hit, and at 18, you get +1 to hit. And then you see this table here, these percentages, that was only for fighters. Fighters were able to roll exceptional strength, including their subclasses. So a fighter with exceptional strength can get a bonus to hit that goes beyond +1. That is sort of a throwback to this idea that your strength is to affect your hit and damage is only for fighters. That's kind of what that's going for. Now you see the damage adjustment here. Again, it doesn't line up. So you would think that the normal for hit probability would align with the damage adjustment being none, but it doesn't. It's off by 1, and the damage adjustment goes up to +2 for an 18 strength. And then again, fighters get that bonus if they have that exceptional strength, where it can go all the way up to +6 at strength 18/00, which is 100%. Okay, so now I think we kind of get an idea of how the ability scores are going to be a little bit different in here, but that's every ability score. They're all going to give you this table that tells you basically at what point that if you've rolled the score, can you be which class and which race. So you see intelligence here, and same thing as we saw with fighters, you need a minimum intelligence of 9 to be a magic user. And, a minimum intelligence of 4 for a half-elf. At a 5, here or lower, the character can only be a fighter, that kind of thing. Okay, so now something new with intelligence is that it's added the possible number of additional languages. So it's giving intelligence a role beyond just if you're a magic user. Whereas in original D&D, there really was not very much of a role for intelligence other than to act again as an experience point booster or penalty for a magic using character. Now, like in Greyhawk, you're going to see this table here. This is an additional table, as we saw in Greyhawk, for a chance for a magic user to know a spell, and then the minimum and maximum number of spells per level. You'll see here, however, the table starts at 9. And why is that? Well, because again, Gary has said that you need a minimum of 9 to be a magic user. We did not see that in Greyhawk. So here you can see a magic user with an intelligence of 3 has a 20% chance to know any given spell, and so on. Okay? So that's intelligence. So really the big changes here, you can kind of see, again, are making minimums for magic users, adding the languages, that kind of thing. Now, wisdom is going to give you a magical attack adjustment. That was something that was in parts of original D&D. Okay, but here, it's going to apply to everybody. You have a minimum wisdom of 9 for a cleric character. And now you see this table down here. This is new, adjustments for clerics, and it's telling you how many bonus spells you're going to get based on your ability score and the chance of spell failure. That is very different from what we see here in Greyhawk, where it specifically tells us that wisdom acts as an experience booster for clerics, serving in no way to help them in either learning or knowing spells. All cleric spells are considered as divinely given, and as such, a cleric with a wisdom factor of 3 would know all of the spells, as well as would a cleric with a wisdom of 18 factor. Okay, so again, that is different. That's a difference. Okay, and then we have dexterity, again, minimum 9 to be a thief. You have your reaction attacking adjustment and your defensive adjustment. So your defensive adjustment is to your AC. And again, remember, this is a game that uses descending armor class. Lower is better. So getting a -4 with an 18 dex, that's good. And getting a +4 with a 3 dex is bad. And then you have your reaction and attacking adjustment. This is for missile attacks. It's penalty or bonus for both surprise situations and missile combat attacks. That's why it's called the reaction or attacking adjustment. Okay, but again, a lot of games have this problem, but it's telling you what this is. It says it's a reaction to your surprise check, but it has yet to tell you what a surprise check is or how to calculate it. So I'm not a fan of things like that. If you saw my video review of Castles and Crusades, where it was presenting things without telling you what it was, and then you have to go like hundreds of pages later to figure out what it is, I think it would have been better to state that up. Okay, so that's Dex, and then you get your table here for your penalty or bonus to thieving skills for your dexterity. Now, one could argue, and you could make this same argument with the intelligence and wisdom tables here, that these should have been put in the section for magic users. There's no reason to put this here or this clerics thing here. This is only applying to clerics. Why isn't this in the section for clerics? Similarly with thieves, why isn't this in the thief section, not in the dex section? Now, with the thief one could argue that, well, this also applies to assassins who are using these same thief skills. So I guess I can understand that. But again, a change in layout would have helped, I think, a little bit. Okay, so then you get Constitution. You have your hit point adjustments here. you have your minimum con for a paladin character at 9. So this is the first one you're going to see where it's not one of the core classes. So we've done strength fighter minimum at 9, intelligence magic user minimum of 9, wisdom cleric minimum of 9, wisdom, and then dexterity was thief minimum of 9. But now here on Constitution, there's no core classes left. So, but it does tell you have to have a minimum of 9 to be a paladin. So you have your hit point adjustment. And again, in these numbers down here in the parentheses, that applies to fighters. Only to fighters. So every other class only gets the +2, but fighters can go up to +4 if they have an 18. Then you have your system shock survival and your resurrection survival. This was a big deal in Advanced D&D, and much more so than it was. I mean, it's in original, but it's a bigger deal here because it's telling you specifically for system shock the percentage chance a character has of surviving the following forms of magical attacks or simple application of the magic: aging, petrification, including flesh to stone, polymorph any object, polymorph others. And then it says, for example, the wicked necromancer polymorphs others, his hireling, into a giant rock, and with the rather foolish agreement of the changee. So what he means is the magic user is casting what could be considered an offensive spell on somebody. And in this case, the retainer, rather than trying to make a saving throw to resist it, agrees to let the magic user, the necromancer in this case, cast polymorph other on him. So he's agreeing to the change, so he doesn't get a saving throw. However, when it happens, he has to make a system shock roll to see if he can survive being turned into a rock. So it says the hireling must make a saving throw. It says saving throw based on his constitution score using the table above. So it's a saving throw, but it's really this percentage here. It's not a standard save. And then it says, assuming he survives, a further saving throw would have to be made if he was again polymorphed or dispelled back to his original form. The saving throw must be equal to or less than the percentage shown. So imagine this is a standard regular hireling. He probably has a con score in the range of, say, 10 to 11, which is pretty standard. Maybe he's exceptional, so maybe he's got a 12 or a 13. But even so, there's a 20% chance with a 12 constitution that he's not going to survive. But it's just, I think it's a very difficult situation to be in. And this comes up all the time. And it's something that is a huge deal of how your constitution affects you. And it's one of the reasons why as a magic user, you wanted a high constitution, not necessarily just for the hit points. You want it for the hit points because magic users have terrible hit dice, T4. So you want those bonus hit points if you can get them. But the other thing was, as you're casting spells, and they're going to get to that in the Dungeon Master's Guide, but certain powerful spells age you prematurely. They cause you to age, like the wish spell causes you to age something like, I forget how many years it is, but let's say 10, it's 10 or something like that. But it artificially just changes your age, increases your age when you cast that spell. Well, it says right here that aging is an effect that can trigger a system shock. So if that happens and a magic user's casting that spell, not only are they going to age themselves, but then they have to check to see if that aging causes them to die of system shock. So it's AD&D can be very, very brutal in terms of that kind of thing. There's all these little subsystems in here that if you don't really pay attention to that, you might not remember or think about the fact that, yeah, the wish spell is the most powerful spell in the game and it causes very cool things to happen, but it is going to artificially age you and trigger a chance that you might die. So that's that. And then resurrection shows you the percentage chance the character has of being successfully raised from the dead. And also it's going to tell you that your con score is the raw score is the number of times that you can successfully be resurrected. So if your con is 9, you can only be resurrected 9 times. After that, it doesn't work anymore. And there's a chance it might not work anyway, because again, you have to roll on this percentage table to see if you're okay. So that's constitution. And then you have charisma here, which is going to affect your maximum number of henchmen, their loyalty base, and then the reaction adjustment. Okay, so a lot of that was in original D&D. Charisma is the one score in here that I think is the most important. And I think people, nowadays would call it a dump stat, although they've made it more important in later editions. But if you're not playing with hirelings and henchmen, charisma can kind of seem pointless. but it is very important, and it gets its own section here with its own table and original, as you see here. Now, what's interesting is you had all of these expansions and additions to how ability scores work that were presented in Greyhawk. However, in Holmes, he almost goes backwards. So in the Holmes edition, you see here, these are the only bonuses or penalties that you get based on your ability scores. So if you have your prime requisite is 15 or more, you get 10% added to your experience. If it's 13, 14, 5%. If it's 7 to 8, you subtract 10%. And if it's 6 or less, 20%. And then if your constitution is high, you get bonus hit points. And if it's low, you subtract hit points. If your dexterity is high, you add +1 to your missile fire. And that's at 13 or more. And then if your dexterity is 8 or less, any missile fired is at -1. There's no dex bonus to your armor class. You see, there's nothing in here for charisma and how that affects the loyalty of your henchmen and how many hirelings you can have. That's because this game only covers levels 1 to 3. So the assumption is you're not getting to, well, you can't get to high enough level in here where you would be hiring people for the most part, which is kind of weird because in basic D&D, which the Moldvay basic, there's going to be a whole discussion of hirelings and henchmen. And in my daughter's game that I run basic D&D from 1981 for her and her friends. They hired people starting at level 1 because they realized that like they were going to be in trouble if they didn't. However, there's nothing in here about doing that. So Holmes really takes a very streamlined approach. And then this one here, Advanced D&D Players Handbook, this is going to take all these changes that were proposed in Greyhawk and blow them out and make them much more significant and much more detailed. Okay, so that's our discussion on ability scores. I know that took kind of a long time, but I just wanted to show you just that one section. There are so many changes that are in here. The core of it is the same. The idea of it is the same, but the presentation and what these scores mean and how they're going to be used in the game is so much more detailed in Advanced D&D than we saw previously. So now let's start talking about the races that are presented in here for player characters. And they're presented firstly here on this table, which is going to tell you which race can be which class. So the discussion is races, but before they even tell you what the race is, you're going to get this table here that's going to tell you which race can be which class. Okay, so this is an edition of D&D. It's not race as class, which is what Moldvay Basic is. Moldvay is the first edition of D&D to have race as class, where an elf or a dwarf or a halfling are classes, not races. A lot of people think original D&D is, but we've talked before about why that isn't the case. So see my videos on race as class. I have a whole video on that. And it discusses that because a lot of people get confused and think original D&D is race as class, and it is not. Okay, so this is going to tell you which race can be which class, and it's going to follow pretty closely to what was outlined in Greyhawk Supplement 1, and then also the additional supplements for Blackmore and Eldritch Wizardry, but not always. So one of the things that this tells you in Greyhawk, and it's a really interesting little thing that a lot of people, I think, didn't necessarily pick up on, is that it tells you that if you were what they called at the time a fighting man, if you were a fighting man with a charisma of 17 or higher, and you'd been lawful since the start of your career, meaning from first level on, that you could be a paladin. Well, this book tells you, Men in Magic, that dwarves and halflings are fighting men. So it says they can be fighting men. So you're not playing a dwarf, you're playing a dwarf fighting man. So yeah, it's limited because you only have one class option until this comes out. And then at that point, dwarves, hobbits, or halflings and elves can all be thieves as well as their original ones. But in this one, you were playing a dwarf fighting man or fighter. So you could have been a dwarf fighter, and if you had a charisma of 17 or higher when Greyhawk came out, you could have qualified as a paladin. This is going to change that and tell you that only humans can be paladins. Okay, now similarly, Eldritch Wizardry tells you that only humans can be druids. However, this table is going to show you that a half-elf can be a druid. Okay, so these are all your different discussions of the which class and which race your character can be. And then over here, you're going to have that basically a repeat of that exact same table. However, this time it's going to tell you how far a character can advance in level for these classes. Why this was ever split up into two separate tables, I have no idea. All you needed was this one. You didn't need this other table. You could have just had this one, but whatever. So now you see these numbers here. It's going to tell you that dwarves, elves, and gnomes have this number in parentheses for cleric. That means you can't be a cleric as a player character dwarf, but there are clerics among dwarven NPCs, similarly with elves and gnomes. And then among halflings, there are halfling NPC druids, but not as player characters. Now that's all going to get changed later when 1985, when Unearthed Arcana comes out, and they're going to open up a lot more classes to a lot more races. But for here, you see these little limits here. So dwarves can be fighters, thieves, and assassins. That's pretty close to what was in here, although I believe in Blackmore, it tells you that assassins can only be humans. So they're opening up the assassin to other things. So what's new in here? Well, you are going to have adding the gnome. So gnomes before were monsters, and in Advanced D&D, Gary has promoted them to player character status. Okay, so you have dwarves, elves, and halflings, which were the original three races from original D&D. Half-elves debuted in Greyhawk, Supplement 1. So you're seeing a repeat of them here. And then gnomes and half-orcs are going to be new. So half-orc is also new in Advanced D&D as a player character option. And so then you can see all these things here. You see these level limits. So that was another thing that Advanced D&D did, and that was done for, balancing factor, and it was picked up from original D&D. The demi-humans, the non-human characters in original D&D cannot advance in level as far as humans can. Okay, so those are some of the new things then, gnomes and half-orcs, as far as like the races. Okay, and also what classes they could operate as. All right, and then you're going to get this table here that's going to tell you the ability score minimum and maximums for each race, for each ability score. Now it's going to get to the character race descriptions. Now this is where we're also going to see some differences from what's in original D&D, because these non-human races are going to have a lot more special abilities to them than what we saw in original. So first it tells you that, character dwarves can be fighters, thieves, or assassins, and what level possibilities they have. And then what they can multi-class as, which is fighter, thief. And then it's going to tell you that they're non-magical, and they never use magical spells. However, this nature gives them a bonus with regard to saving throws. So they're going to get a saving throw to magic. Okay, and they're also going to get a similar saving throw to poison. And then they all speak all these different languages, and it tells you the languages they speak. And then it says that they can see in the dark. They can see radiation in the infrared spectrum. So it's called infravision in this version of the game. Nowadays, people would call it dark vision or whatever, but here it was called infravision. And then it says they're miners of great skill, so they can detect the following things. And then it gives you this whole table and what chance it is that they have of detecting all these different things. Detect greater slope, detect new construction, detect sliding or shifting walls, detect traps involving pits, falling blocks, and other stonework, determine approximate depth underground and the probability. And that they have to actively be doing it. It doesn't just come to them, naturally. And then in combat, they add 1 to their die rolls to hit opponents who are half-orcs, goblins, hobgoblins, or orcs. And then when they're being attacked by ogres, trolls, ogre magi, giants, and or titans, they subtract 4 from their opponent's to hit dice because of their dwarf's small stature and combat ability. So this edition definitely gets into, it's very Tolkiensian in nature, but like these racial animosities that exist. Okay, and then it's going to say they get a bonus of 1 added to their initial constitution and a penalty of 1 on their charisma score. So that's also new. This is something new in Advanced D&D. It's this table right here, which is that races get bonuses or penalties to their ability scores. So that was something carried all the way up through 5th edition. I know it's changed now to where your bonuses and penalties are based on your background, not on your race. But this is where you first see it. This didn't exist in original D&D. This table here of adding 1 to Constitution and subtracting 1 from Charisma as a dwarf, or elves adding +1 to Dexterity but -1 to Charisma. Half-orcs add +1 to Strength and Constitution but a -2 to Charisma, and then halflings have a -1 to Strength and a +1 to Dexterity. So this was really trying to make these races kind of different, and again conforming to that kind of Tolkiensian standard of fantasy that was very, very popular at the time. Okay, so that's your dwarf. So it talks all about that. And then it's very specifically tells you that the charisma penalty only applies to non-dwarfs. So you should record your initial score before you take that -1, because your initial score will be how dwarves see you. And that could affect if you only hire dwarf hirelings. All right, but it just as an example, we'll look at the dwarf description in Men and Magic, Book 1 of original Dungeons and Dragons. So it says they can opt only for the fighting class. They never progress beyond level 6. They have a high level of magic resistance, so they add 4 levels when rolling saving throws. So a 6th level dwarf is the equivalent of a 10th level human. That's how they got the bonus in this particular version. They're the only characters able to employ the +3 magic warhammer. That's not explained in Advanced D&D yet, let's say. So it has that, and it says they can note slanting passages, traps, shifting walls, and other new construction underground settings. There's no roll. There's no, it just, that's it. That's all it says about what they can do. And that's up to the DM to determine what that means. Or in this case, the referee, because that's what it was called here. And then they're able to speak the languages of gnomes, kobolds, and goblins in addition to the usual tongues. Okay, that's it. No combat ability bonuses or penalties. None of that stuff. That is all new. So I'm just going to go over dwarves, but every race gets stuff like that added. Elves add things like the 90% resistance to sleep and charm, which is a hallmark of elves in like this edition of the game and also in second edition. That's something that was added here for the first time. And adding bonuses when they're attacking with bows or swords, their languages that they speak, of course, but this, all these ideas of like, again, they also have infravision, the ability to find secret or concealed doors. So they add a bonus to their initial dexterity score. And if they're alone and not in metal armor or well in advance, 90 feet or more of a party, which does not consist entirely of elves and or halflings, the elven character moves as silently as though he or she will surprise monsters on a d6 roll of 1 through 4. So 66 2/3% of the time. Unless some portal must be opened in order to confront the monster. In the latter case, the chance for surprise drops to 33%. So a 1 to 2 on a d6. But again, a lot of that is different, or just expanded on from what was here for the elves. So it talks about here, elves operate automatically as fighter magic users, and they're able to note secret or hidden doors, more able to. And then it does tell you that they get the advantages noted in chainmail when fighting certain fantastic creatures. But again, if you don't have chainmail, you don't know what that is. And then it says finally you can speak the languages, all these different languages. So they're really expanding that. And again, that is really the expansion of the races in here, as far as like what they can and can't do. So then you get your racial preference table. Again, this was a big thing in Advanced D&D, telling you how each race thought of the other races. So P is preferred. So dwarves prefer other dwarves. They show antipathy to elves, goodwill to gnomes. They're neutral to half-elves. They show goodwill to halflings, but then there's this whole table only with regard to tall fellows and stouts. Other halflings are regarded with tolerance. They hate half-orcs, and then they're neutral to humans. So this was intended to help you role play how your character saw, not just NPCs, but other members of the party. So, you don't have to play it this way, but this was intended to show you like the typical. It says here racial references, but then here it says racial preferences. So how each race prefers every other race. Okay, and then I always thought this is one of my favorite pictures. Well, it is one of my favorite pictures, like line drawings from the Player's Handbook, is this picture showing you a human, an elf, a dwarf, a half-orc, and a half-elf. So you don't get a gnome or a halfling in this picture, but you get all these other ones here. And somebody pointed out once to me that they thought the half-orc looks like John Malkovich, and now I can never unsee it. So, yeah, so that's that. So then you're going to get into the classes, and, you know, for the most part, this is going to incorporate all of the classes that are proposed in the 3 supplements. So that's going to be well, first off, the thief, because that was in Greyhawk is where the thief first debuts. But the subclasses of paladin, the monk subclass of cleric, which in here is made in Advanced D&D, is going to be made into a full class, not a subclass. It's going to have the thief subclass of assassins and then the druid subclass of cleric. Okay, so all of those are going to appear in here. Now, the 2 other ones that are going to be in here are going to be the illusionist and the ranger. And I have a video where I talk about those, but those debuted in a magazine called the Strategic Review. Illusionist might have been in Dragon. Ranger, I know specifically, was in Strategic Review. And originally the Ranger was done as a sort of alternative to the Paladin. So it was based on the Paladin that debuted again in Greyhawk. Paladin debuts in Greyhawk. And the guy who wrote up the Ranger, I think his name was Joe Fisher, writes it up in Strategic Review, and he bases it on the Paladin class and then makes some tweaks to it. Okay, so Gary pretty much lifts that idea up of the Ranger, and then also the Illusionist was from Peter Aronson. And I did talk about this briefly before, but if you look here, and you see Peter Aronson's name along with, you're going to see Joe Fisher's name right there. So those 2, he doesn't credit what they were. He just credits them, says thanks. But those were the 2 people that created the Ranger and the Illusionist. So they're going to appear in here as classes. And Gary pretty much lists them almost word for what was in those original ones. He has to change it a little bit because they were created for original D&D, not advanced. So he's tweaking them a little bit. But this table here is going to show you all your available character types, the hit die that they use, and that's going to be a change. So if you remember originally, in original D&D, every class had D6 hit points, or D6 hit dice, I should say. So that was original D&D. Greyhawk is where you get an option that the referee can give different, because also every weapon in original D&D was did die 6 damage. Didn't matter. 2-handed sword, dagger does die 6. This Greyhawk says, well, you can have differing damage scores for different weapons. So a dagger would do D4 as an example, and a 2-handed sword would do more. I forget what it was. But it says if you're going to do that, also every player character class should also have different hit dice. And this is where, in Greyhawk, is where you get magic users using D4, clerics using a D6, and then fighters get a D8. Well, in here, fighters are going to get a bump up to D10. So this is the first time you're going to see D10 hit dice for any class, and it's going to be for the fighter. Okay, clerics and druids get a bump up to D8. Magic users and illusionists stay at D4, and then thieves and assassins, originally the thief was a D4 in Greyhawk. They're going to get a bump to D6. So because the thief gets bumped up, that means the cleric has to get bumped up, and that's why the fighter gets bumped up to D10. It's all this like sliding scale of math and game balance that Gary was doing to change the hit dice. The idea of different characters having different hit dice debuts in Greyhawk, but these kind of the solidification to like even now. So this is done in 1978. Fighters in the 5th edition game, 2014, that came out, and I believe, as far as I'm aware, in the 2024 edition of D&D, also have, still to this day, have D10 hit dice. So that debuted all the way back here in 1978. The maximum number of hit dice each class gets, and it's different depending on like how far they go. And then once they hit that maximum, they just get a flat score per level. So that's not something that new games do, but original D&D, there was this idea, or, you know, advanced D&D, once you get to a certain level, you've maxed out your hit point potential, and then you're just going to get, you know, a set amount per level. And it's usually pretty low, like 1 or 2. Okay, and then it tells you whether the class has spell ability. And in this case, like fighters don't have any spell ability at all, nor do monks. And nor do thieves and assassins, but you see like these asterisks here. That's because thieves and assassins eventually get the ability to read magical scrolls. And then you see these asterisks for paladins and rangers, and that's because they do get spell ability, but later on, like at 8th level or 9th level, depending on the class and what kind of spells they get. Okay, but it was a little bit different from fifth edition, where every class has spell casting ability starting at almost seems like level 1. And then your class level limit. So most of them are none, but the druid, the assassin, and the monk had a certain point where they couldn't gain levels anymore because they had topped out, and that was it. So druid at 14, as well as assassin at 14, monks at 17. And then you have all your notes here. So those are kind of like the main differences as far as the classes being proposed. Now, again, I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about the differences in the cleric, the fighter, and the magic user versus what was presented in Men in Magic Volume 1. So I guess somewhat interestingly, the three core classes, cleric, fighter, and magic user, are really not going to differ that much from their descriptions in here, other than the hit dice. Obviously, some of the little details like the fighter progression on attack tables and that kind of stuff, all of them, they're going to be different from what's in here. But what each class can and can't do is pretty standard. So when it talks about the cleric, it tells you that their prime requisite is wisdom and that high scores of strength and constitution are also desirable. And then it tells you they use 8-sided hit dice. It says they can be any alignment save true neutral. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. That they have certain holy symbols that they use. They're forbidden from using edged and or pointed weapons, which shed blood. They have their own spell list. And that their role is to fortify, protect, and revitalize. So they have limited attack spells, but they have, which are usually the reverse form of their curative spells. And that they can use spells that have to be spoken or read aloud, and they have the ability to wear armor, carry effective weaponry, and engage in hand-to-hand combat with a reasonable chance of success, and that they can turn away undead, and then the less powerful demons and devils. And then it gives you a list of what counts as undead, and then only humans normally have clericism as their soul class, so they're the only race that can advance with unlimited levels. And then they have a fair number of magic items, including most potions, clerical and protection scrolls, rings, wands, rods, staves, some magical items, other non-edged, non-pointed magical weaponry, magical armor, and magical shields. When they get to be 8th level, they can automatically attract followers if the cleric establishes a place of worship. And then it tells you what kind of followers you're going to get. And then upon reaching 9th level, you have the option of constructing a religious stronghold. The fortified place must contain a large temple, cathedral, or church of not less than 2,500 square feet on the ground floor. It can be a castle, monastery, or abbey, or the like. And it must be dedicated to the cleric's deity or deities. And then it talks about the construction of it, and then how the people are going to come and how much monthly revenue you're going to get, and then it's going to give you your level titles here. There is no level title for a 5th level cleric, but other than that, you can see the level titles there. So let's compare that just really briefly, and you're going to see how similar it is. And that's going to be here. Says they gain some of the advantages from both the magic user and fighter. So if you saw my video on the cleric before, I said that really this is the first multi-class. That's exactly what the cleric is. It's the role that it plays mechanically in the game. It's part fighter, part magic user. So not as good a fighter as a full fighter, and not as good a magic user as a full magic user, but you're combining both of them. Okay, so but they have the ability to wear magic armor. Yep, check. Non-edged weapons, check. Okay, so they have their own spells, check. They're able to use more magical items than the fighting man, check. And when they reach top level, they can opt to build their own stronghold, and doing so, they receive help from above. Now, this one gives them a little bonus from their deity when they're constructing. And then it says that they're going to attract followers of faithful people to come to such a castle, being fanatically loyal, and they will serve at no cost. And then it's going to tell you what kind you're going to get. It says that at 7th level or higher, you have to be either law or chaos. So you can't be neutral as a higher level cleric. And that there's a sharp distinction between them. Okay, and then it says clerics with castles of their own will have control of a territory similar to a barony of fighters, and then they're going to receive tithes in terms of like their monthly revenue. So all of that is pretty similar. Now, the advanced D&D tells you that the clerics can turn undead, and it looks like it's not in here. Well, they can in original D&D. It's just for whatever reason, it is put here in this section on saving throws and attack tables. And so you see that here. There's a list of spells that clerics can use. And then clerics versus undead monsters. This is the first hint that you have. There's no explanation that clerics can turn undead, and it gives you a table using level titles, not levels. And then it just tells you the numbers of the score to match or exceed in order to turn away. Roll with 2 6-sided dice. And then it tells you your effect is, turn, dispel, or end. And that's it. That's the only bit on turning undead in all of original Dungeons & Dragons is this tiny little table here. And it's not in the cleric section. It's in the section on cleric spells. Okay, but anyway, that's the cleric. So you can see how similar it is. Well, the fighter is very, very similar. So, they can use any magic weapon or armor, and it says that that's their main benefit. The fighter is the only class that can use any of those types of things. They do have some limited other magic items that they can use. They can construct a barony or, a stronghold, and then they're going to attract followers. So all that is detailed in the section on the fighter. But you can see it's pretty short. And it's because they don't really have a lot in Advanced D&D. Okay, and they also have higher hit points than any other character class other than paladins. And it says kind of like rangers as well, although for whatever reason, Gary makes the odd choice to have rangers use D8 hit dice instead of D10, but he gives them two hit die at first level. Okay, so that's fighter. And then magic user, same thing. And it's that cartoon my mom put in here when I was a kid. So it talks about, that they get all these different spells, but they're pretty weak physically, and that, all the different magic items that they can use, and that then they can construct a stronghold, and they're going to get followers for that. So that was a big thing in all these original editions of D&D, original, and in even in BX that I play, and then in Advanced, this idea that the goal of your character was to get to the point where you were going to construct a stronghold, and then you were going to control a territory, and then usually at that point you were going to retire that character and start a new one. That was a big thing in Advanced, and like I said, original, and even in basic D&D that people don't really do too much anymore, but all of those characters do that. Now, every class in this Advanced D&D is going to have some form of that, where whether you're creating a hideout as a thief, or whether you're creating, some kind of guild thing as an assassin, or a school as a monk, or whatever it is, you are getting to a point where you're constructing some kind of location, and then you're attracting followers. Rangers get some pretty cool followers in here that are more animal based, which is kind of fun. But for the most part, that's what that is. So as far as the details of this, in Advanced D&D, not that different from original. It's just, more expansive. It's expanded a little bit more. The experience points tables are changed. But what's interesting is that, again, if you looked at, we went into over the cleric in the most detail. The cleric in Advanced D&D, other than the hit dice being raised to D8, is really not any different from the cleric in original D&D, which again, I think doesn't necessarily help Gary's argument when he claimed that Advanced D&D was a wholly new and separate game that had nothing to do with original D&D. Now, partly the combat system is different because it implements some different kinds of things, and we'll talk about that again when we get into going over the Dungeon Master's Guide. But by and large, this Player's Handbook is not really that different than original Men in Magic. It's just a little bit more detailed. Again, it has all these other classes, but these were all part of original D&D as well, other than the Ranger and the Illusionist, which were taken from Strategic Review. Okay, so that's your classes here. So the Monk is presented last, and this is a difference from what was in Blackmore. So in Blackmore, again, we've talked about this, but the Monk is presented as a subclass of Cleric. And in here, it's presented as its own class, and it's put in alphabetical order. It's put at the end of the list, and that's because Gary said they're super powerful, and a DM might not want to put them into their game. Okay, but as far as the way that they function and their abilities and all that stuff, it's very, very close to what's in here, at least very strongly based on what that was. So that's character classes, and then I want to talk about alignment, because the Advanced D&D Players Handbook is really kind of the first time where you start to get a full sense in a big published book, not a magazine article, where you're going to get a full sense of the 9-point alignment system. Okay, so I have a whole video on the history of alignment in D&D, so you can get into more details on that if you want to understand how it started with 3 and then it went to 5 in this, which was based on an article that Gary wrote in Dragon Magazine, and then how it expanded to 9 in the Player's Handbook, and there were also mentions of it in deities and demigods and things like that. So you're going to want to watch that video for more history of that and why it is structured the way that it is. But the Player's Handbook for Advanced D&D, this is the first time where as a player, you had an option to pick from the standard 9 alignments that we still use today in, like I said, 5th edition and in the 2024 edition. So that's alignment, which is a change because again, in original D&D, you have 3 alignments. You have law, chaos, and neutrality, and that's it. And then in Holmes D&D, and we've talked about this before, you have 5 alignments. You have good and evil, law and chaos, and neutral. But again, this is the first one where you get that breakdown of all 9 of the standard types that we're used to: chaotic neutral, chaotic good, chaotic evil, lawful good, lawful neutral, neutral evil, neutral good, and true neutral. So that is the bit on alignment that is, again, going to be different. This is the bit on hit points that I wanted to talk to you about. And I mentioned this during kind of my intro here. But it talks about how, let us assume that a character with 26 hit points is engaged in an adventure. Early in the course of exploring the dungeon, he or she falls into a 10-foot deep pit, taking 6-sided die of damage, 4 hit points of damage. The character drops to 22. Next takes 15 points of damage and drops to 7. The cleric heals them, and it goes on. And it says your character class determines which sort of die you will roll to determine your hit points. In some campaigns, the referee will keep this total secret, informing players only that they feel strong, fatigued, or very weak, thus indicating waning hit points. In other campaigns, the dungeon master will have the players record their character's hit points and keep track of all changes. Both methods are acceptable, and it is up to your DM as to which will be used in the campaign you participate in. I have never played in a campaign where the DM kept our hit points secret from us, or whereas players we didn't know. Like the DM would just tell us, like, during the course of combat, you just took 7 points of damage or whatever it was, and you cross it out and change it on your sheet in pencil. And so I'm just curious if any of you have ever played in a game where the DM did keep that secret and they use like these adjectives or these terms, strong, fatigued, very weak, to indicate how your character was feeling rather than telling you how many hit points you have left. I would love to hear people that play like that, what your experience was, whether you liked playing like that, or if you'd consider doing it now in a game, and how you think your players might respond if they're used to knowing the nitty-gritty details. So definitely leave that in the comments below. I'd love to hear from that. Okay, so that's hit points. That's really no different. I just kind of wanted to read that because that's really sort of it's indicative of how, Gary's headspace as far as like how he thinks a game should be run. All right, then you've got your character languages. All this is pretty standard stuff. Starting money, again, is pretty standard. The amounts are different, but the way it's done is very, very simple or similar. Then you've got your basic equipment over here and your costs. Okay, so this is where I kind of wanted to start talking about some differences. So the armor class in Advanced D&D is going to start at 10 for being no armor, and it's going to go down as it gets better. Okay. In original D&D, it was based on 9. So 9 was no armor. And then the scale goes down from there. So Advanced D&D is a difference because it's 10. So anyway, it just goes on to tell you your armor class rating here. And then it says for each +1 of magic armor, you decrease the armor classes given. So the scale is, again, going to be a little bit different. The best that you can get without magic is plate mail plus shield, which is an armor class of 2. Now that will change again when Unearthed Arcana comes out, because there's more armor types in there, including field plate and full plate, which are better than plate mail. But in this version right now, 1978, the best armor you could get was plate mail plus a shield for an AC of 2. All right, and then it's going to talk about weapons. Now here's going to be another change. Weapon proficiency. This is a big change in terms of how characters use weapons. So in this version of the game, Men in Magic, it tells you that fighters can use any weapon. It tells you that clerics can use any non-edged or non-pointy weapon. And then it tells you that magic users can use like a dagger, right? So it's telling you very specifically, and that's what you get. Okay, well, here you get weapon proficiencies. So fighters can use any weapon, or like they have the ability to learn to use any weapon. But when they start out, they only know how to use 4. And that if they try to use a weapon that they're not familiar with, they're going to take a -2 to use that weapon. And then every 3 levels, they get to pick a new weapon that they're going to learn. So the difference here is that in original Dungeons and Dragons, a fighter can just go along, and then if they find a weapon that is presumably better than the one that they have, they can just drop whichever weapon they're carrying, pick up the new weapon and start using it, right? And that goes for magical weapons as well. So if a fighter is carrying a mace and comes in original D&D and comes across a magical sword, they can ditch the mace and pick up that magical sword and immediately use it. In advanced D&D, the fighter would have to have picked sword as one of his original weapon proficiencies. And if he didn't, say out of these 4 weapons, say he picked longbow, dagger, mace, and I don't know, halberd. I'm just making it up, right? And then comes across a magic sword and picks it up. Well, he's going to take -2 to hit with that sword because he's not proficient with it until he gains a new level. And then presumably he could then pick sword, depending on the kind of sword, which is another big deal here because your swords are split up. It's not just sword. You've got bastard sword, broadsword, longsword, short sword, two-handed sword. Those are all different weapon proficiencies that you would have to take in order to know how to use them. Okay, so this idea of weapon proficiencies, this is new. This is something that's unique to advanced D&D at this point in time that's not in original Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, is how many weapon proficiencies you get. You see magic users only get 1, as do illusionists and monks. Clerics and druids get 2. Fighters get the most at 4, so that's a benefit for a fighter. Even paladins and rangers only get 3. Thieves only get 2, and assassins get 3. The non-proficiency penalty is quite different depending on your class. So a magic user on non-proficiency penalty is -5, whereas for a fighter, it's only -2. And then clerics, druids, thieves, assassins are kind of somewhere in between. And then the rate at which you gain a new weapon proficiency scales here. Okay, so that is a pretty big change in this book. And then you see this table here, which is going to be your weight and damage by weapon type. So you had to know how much your weapon weighed and then how much damage it was going to do to small or medium opponents or to large opponents. So that's your weapon table. And then you have a whole other table over here. This one's maybe a little bit more infamous in advanced D&D circles. This is going to be your weapon length, the space required to wield that weapon, the speed factor, and then the armor class adjustment. So this is what's interesting. This is what it says. Well, first off, you have italics indicating weapons capable of dismounting a rider on a score equal to or greater than the hit score. And then you can disarm an opponent if you hit AC 8 with certain weapons. And then you can treat as a long sword if used one-handed. That's the bastard sword. And then any weapon strikes at +2 against an opponent's back or similarly unseen, and then against stunned, prone, or motionless opponents, any weapon strikes at +4. So that table is going to be there. So then you see here, it says speed factor and armor class adjustment. And then notice it doesn't actually tell you right here in this table what that means. There's no indication of what you're supposed to do with that. So, and again, that's because combat isn't explained here. It's explained in this book. So the Dungeon Master's Guide is going to tell you, and again, just as a reminder, it comes out a year later. It's going to tell you what the speed factor means, how to implement that during combat, and then also what the armor class adjustment means. So the short version of this is that your speed factor is really only going to come into play if both sides, or if the attacker and the defender, get the same initiative. That's what most people think, okay? And that's a bit of a tough thing to say because to this day, people still argue about how the combat system in advanced D&D is supposed to work. There's arguments in forums all the time among old-timers who were there playing it at the time, and they don't always agree. And I can guarantee you, if you're one of these people that thinks like, no, it's easy and I know how to run the thing, there are going to be people that have been playing just as long as you who are going to disagree about things like when do spell effects take place and how to use these certain things. But for the most part, the speed factor is mainly used if there's a tie in the initiative. And then the speed factor is going to determine which person gets to strike first. It's also going to come into play if you're attacking a character who is casting a spell, because the spell is going to tell you how many segments it takes to cast that spell. And you're going to make some differences in the amount of segments it takes to cast a spell versus the weapon speed factor. You're also adding in your initiative as a factor in all this to figure out if you are able to disrupt that spellcaster before the spell goes off, even if it's not your turn in the initiative order. So Now, the armor class adjustment is essentially if you're attacking an opponent with certain type of armor, and that's a huge problem with this table because it says armor class. There is a very specific use of the term armor class, which is how hard are you to hit in this game? What number do I need to roll to compare to see if I hit you? And armor class is different from armor type. And it later on in the Dungeon Master's Guide, it tells you this is actually referring to the type of armor, meaning AC 7 is, I believe, supposed to indicate that the opponent is wearing leather armor, and AC 5 would be if you're wearing chainmail. So does this include shields or not? It doesn't tell you that. It never explains whether you're supposed to factor the shield in or not, because chainmail and shield, I believe, is AC 4. But the idea is that certain weapons do a better job at hitting certain or doing damage to people wearing certain types of armor, because certain weapons were designed specifically to combat people wearing that kind of armor. And so the idea is that, especially if you're a fighter and you have a wide array of weapons available to you that you can pick from, you could look and see what that opponent was wearing, and then you could choose the right weapon for the job, because you're going to have a better chance to hit that opponent based on what kind of armor that they are wearing, and you could pick the right weapon for the job. Almost nobody used this. We never used it. I know some people did, and that's fine. But again, it's not really well explained. And in the DM's guide, it's going to tell you it's actually, if you choose to use this, this is what that table actually means, which means that Gary must have even known that he didn't explain it well. And I've heard from many people say who either gamed with Gary or gamed with like one of his sons, Ernie or Luke, at different conventions and stuff. And they've all said that Gary himself didn't use this stuff. He didn't use weapon speeds and armor class adjustments for weapons and all that kind of stuff. So he's adding all this complexity in here, which to a lot of people seemed like they wanted it. They wanted, more realistic combat, whatever. It just adds so much extra time and complexity to this game. But I guess if you liked it, that's cool. But I do think it helped make things a little bit more confusing, and why a lot of people think that Advanced D&D is really not, a lot of people say it's not the game for me because it just has too much of this complexity to it. And I can see an argument for that. But, again, let me know in the comments what you think, and if you like this kind of stuff, or if you did use it, or if you're still using it to this day. So that's weapons and armor. Now let's get into spells. I'm going to skip past Hireling's Henchman, Time and Distance, because not a lot of big differences there. So spells, one of the things that's going to happen here, and this is new for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, it's going to say that most spells have a verbal component and must be uttered. Most spells also have a somatic component, movement of the caster's body, such as gesturing component. And some spells have a third component, that of material. So this idea of certain things that you need to do in order to cast spells is not just memorizing the spell, but it's uttering the words properly, saying them out loud. So you have to be able to speak. You have to be able to move your body in a lot of cases, especially move your hands if you have hand movements. And then you have to have material components. So this is another way that you can sort of, if you want to, nerf a spellcaster. If you know that they're a spellcaster, if you can prevent them from speaking, whether, you capture them and gag them so they can't speak, or you tie their hands so they can't move, or maybe you're a cleric, you can cast a silent spell over to who over the area where you think the enemy magic user is trying to cast their spell, so that their words can't be uttered out loud. They can't be heard. These are all like things that you can use. And this is a new thing as Gary is figuring out how to keep magic users in check, because they could kind of, a lot of people thought they could kind of run away with the game in original D&D. So having these things in place where magic users or clerics, any spellcaster has to follow these procedures in order to cast their spells. It's putting some form of game balance into that. So it talks about that, and then it talks about, this gets into the Vancian magic system. Once cast, a spell is totally forgotten, gone. The mystical symbols impressed upon the brain carry power, and speaking the spell discharges the power, draining all memory of the spell used. Again, I know a lot of people don't like this. I have a video on why D&D's magic system is like this, the fire and forget system, people call it. And so this is a little bit of explaining how that works. And so that you can memorize the same spell twice if you want to, but each counts as a separate use. So you can't cast the same spell more than twice. You can memorize it twice, but if you've only memorized it once, you can't keep casting it, because once you've cast it once, it's gone until you memorize it again. So that is, again, another part of the game balance. It's also part of world building in terms of, if that's how magic works, that's just how it works. And so magic users need to know that, and then work within the system to figure out, like, I need to spend time to be able to memorize these spells, which means that you're not casting spells at the flip of a switch just because you have it memorized, because you don't know when is the next time you're going to be able to memorize that spell. So you're picking the right spells to memorize for the day, and then you're holding on to them until of utmost need. Okay, so it's a completely different way of playing, and I know a lot of people don't like that. They want to play the video game version where your powers just replenish all the time and you always constantly have spells at your fingertips, and that's fine if that's the kind of game that you enjoy. But I know, like, in my daughter's game that I run, 1981 Molde Basic D&D, 2 of the players are elves, and they are 2nd level, so they each know 2 first level spells. And they memorize the spells at the beginning of each day, and they will talk about, like, at the start of prep day, they will remember to tell me that they're doing that, because I've told them, if you didn't tell me that you did that, maybe you didn't do it. So I'm trying to just remember that, I'm trying to get them to remember that they have to mention all these things or else it didn't happen. And so they'll tell me that they are going to spend time to memorize their spells for the day, and whether they're going to prepare the same spell that they know twice, or they're going to prepare, they each know 2 spells, 1 of each, however they're going to do it. And I'd say in a given session, maybe we've been playing for like 4 years at about, I don't know, around 30 sessions or so, maybe a little bit less. It was roughly once a month, but we've had some hiatus periods. But let's call it 30 sessions. I'd say each of them has cast spells maybe like 3 or 4 times. Like, and I know that a lot of people just probably think that that's really weird, but they're keeping them for the situations when they know it's going to have the most impact. So the plus side, or the pro side of that, is that when they've cast those spells, those have been some of the most memorable moments in the campaign. It's when they go like, oh, I'm going to use Hold Portal to do this, or I'm going to use ventriloquism to trick this person into this. And they've used them so cleverly that I've been very struck by, like, how cool it was that they did that, and how they were thinking on their feet to use the spells in those particular circumstances. And like I said, those are very memorable times versus if they just did it all the time. All right. But anyway, so let's get back to this and look at how the spell descriptions are explained in here. And they are explained pretty much the same way for clerics and magic users. I'm going to go to the magic user spell section. So let's look at, there's Hold Portal, there's Light. So let's just look at Light. Level 1, it gives you the range, it gives you the duration, how long it's going to last, the area of effect, the components, VS, that means it has a verbal component and a somatic component. There's no M, like you see up here for jump. There's an M, that's material. Light does not have a material component. The casting time is 1 segment. So casting time is key in here. So Find Familiar is going to take between 1 and 24 hours. It's not something you're going to cast in the middle of combat. So, or Identify takes 1 turn. That's 10 minutes, right? Most of the combat type oriented spells are going to be 1 segment, but not always. And the reason that makes a difference is because, again, I was talking about this earlier. So if you saw my video on Eldritch Wizardry Supplement 3, you saw that there was an alternative to the combat system proposed in here, or sort of like an expansion, whatever you want to call it, that added segments. And it broke a round down into 8 segments. So you have turns, then within turns, you have a combat round, which in original D&D is 1 minute, which is going to be the same in advanced D&D. It's a 1 minute round. And then Eldritch Wizardry breaks that 1 round down into 8 segments. Dungeons & Dragons Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, it's going to break that down into 10 segments. So the segment is the specific point during the round during which your character is going to take the action that they're going to take. It's separate from, but related to initiative. Again, it gets very confusing, but the casting time for a spell, these segments are very, so you see, like, the higher you go up in level, the more segments it takes to cast a spell. And the segments are going to impact the ability of an enemy to try to disrupt your spell casting. So And again, we're going to get into this in much more detail when we get to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide and talking about combat. But the way that combat works roughly is that the players announce their intentions of what they're going to do during the round before initiative is even rolled. So if you want to cast a spell, you would tell the Dungeon Master that you're going to cast that spell, and then all the other players are going to say what they're going to do. The Dungeon Master is going to pick what the monsters are going to do, the bad guys, whatever. And then initiative is going to be rolled. And the amount of time that it takes you to cast your spell in segments impacts when that spell is going to go off, as well as like when the effect is going to take place, as well as when, again, can an enemy disrupt you before you get to that? Because if you are harmed by physical attack or another spell being cast at you before your spell completes taking effect because of the number of segments, then your spell is wasted and it doesn't take place. So again, another way that you can try to I say nerf. It's not nerf. It's the game balance. It's ways to affect a magic user and prevent them from taking over the entire game. If you know that they're casting a spell, again, if you're using those weapon speed factors, if that's part of your game, you might pick a different weapon and your tactic might be different if you're trying to disrupt that caster from casting a spell before that spell can take effect. Okay. So there's a lot of discussion over when does the magic user start casting their spell. Does it happen on the first segment of the round? And then it takes, however many segments, like Ice Storm takes 4 segments. So Ice Storm would therefore go off and its effect would go into place on segment 4. Or do they act on the segment that they rolled on their initiative die? You're rolling a d6 for initiative and it's side initiative. So if you rolled a 4 on your side initiative, then you start casting your spell on segment 4 and then it would go off on segment 8 because it takes 4 segments. Now, most people don't do it that way, but it's not really well explained to know which one or the other is right. Most people do it that the magic user starts casting a spell at the beginning of the round on the first segment. And so therefore, the Ice Storm would take place or would take effect on segment 4. But again, it's not necessarily described in detail that way to know 100% if that's accurate or not. So, and again, those are, you want to see arguments about anything about Advanced D&D. The one argument, or the main argument I think you're going to see, is trying to figure out the combat system and the initiative system and how that works, like encounters. Okay. But those are spells. So the actual effects of the spells are very, very similar. Obviously, there's a lot more spells in here. So a huge chunk of this book, of the Player's Handbook, is taken up with describing spell effects. Because they take a lot of room and they also do repeat quite a bit. But this is the whole book, like how much of that is dedicated to spells. And technically even this, because these are spell tables. So you have a few more pages here. And now a lot of times it will repeat the spell and say like, oh, this is the same as the magic user spell of level blah, 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 or like whatever it is, right? And clerics and magic users do have some spells in common, such as light. But they don't always tell you to refer somewhere else. Sometimes they do, but not always. Okay, so like, see, here's light described for a cleric. And the cleric light spell takes 4 segments to cast. The magic user version of light, as we saw earlier, takes 1 segment. So they're different. This is with the exceptions noted above. The spell is the same as the first level cleric spell light. So that's the spells section that's in here. Okay, so again, it's actually pretty different because you're adding this layer of complexity with the components, verbal, somatic, and verbal. You're also adding the timing aspect of how long it takes to cast a spell, meaning when is the spell effect going to take place. And that's not really something that you see too much in original D&D. So those are some pretty big changes. Big changes in terms of the impact on gameplay, I guess. It seems like a small change, but, because the components is another one. Again, you can gag your opponent, you can bind their hands, you can put them in a zone of silence to prevent them from casting spells. You can also have them captured and take away their spell components. You can introduce things where the cleric or the magic user, whoever it is, wants to learn a certain spell or has learned a certain spell. Maybe they have a scroll or something, or they've copied it out of another person's spell book and they've learned a new spell, but it requires some kind of rare component that they don't have access to. Where are they supposed to get that? And then that becomes part of the game and the adventure is this magic user has the ability to cast that spell, except they can't until they find that component, right? So those are all things that are added in here as a balancing factor on magic users. So then it's going to get into like the adventure here. And this is really just kind of telling you like, what are you going to be doing during this game? Dungeon expeditions, you're crawling through the underworld and you should equip yourself, in a certain way with iron spikes and rope and that kind of thing. And then it talks about outdoor exploration and how you should equip yourself. Okay. And then town adventures, similar. So all that kind of thing is how they're going to kind of approach this part. It's really, again, just kind of talking about what's going to happen during the game. You've got your encumbrance in here. I'm not going to really get into the weeds on that. Original D&D also has encumbrance. They just kind of handle it differently, but the effect is the same. Then you get into your movement. It just talks about the distances you can travel. And again, it's going to break it down into rounds and segments because you have segments during combat. And then it talks about movement outdoors versus in cities. It's going to explain what infravision and then ultravision is. None of the player character races have ultravision, but some monsters do. And some spells, I think, can also give you ultravision. So it's going to talk about what that means. Silent movement and invisible movement. And then surprise. And it's going to talk a little bit about surprise, which is interesting because he's still not going to explain the combat system. So then it's going to, and again, this is where you get this layer of complexity that just seems almost unnecessary. So surprise is simply the unexpected or unprepared for. Characters can be surprised just as creatures they encounter can. Noise and light can negate chances for surprise with respect to characters or creatures they encounter. It's usually expressed as a 2 in 6 chance for all parties concerned. That is, a 6-sided die is rolled with a 1 or 2 indicating surprise. So this is a difference in the way Gary's going to talk in Advanced D&D, because in original D&D, he wouldn't have told you what that meant. He would say, he wouldn't probably even tell you to roll a 6-sided die. He would say, surprise is expressed on 1 or 2 on the die or something like that. And then he would just move on and assume that you know what that means. Here, he's going to specifically spell out how to calculate that, because I think, again, it was understood that Gary made a lot of assumptions when he was writing original D&D that people knew what he was talking about, because he was using nomenclature that was very common among war gamers. But you're starting to get a lot of people playing D&D that have no background in playing war games. Some monsters are more capable of surprising foes than the normal 2 and 6, and then they can be surprised. They cannot be surprised easily, so they have a reduced probability, such as a 1 in 6 or a 1 in 8. Each one of surprise equals 1 segment or 6 segments of time lost to the surprised party. So again, remember, your segments, you have 10 in a round, but you're rolling a d6 for surprise, and that's going to determine how many segments are lost. And during the lost time, the surprising party can freely act or to escape or attack or whatever. If both parties are surprised, then the effect is negated or reduced. So then you have the surprise die difference, 0, 1, 2, or 3, and then how many segments you lose, which is 0, 1, 2, or 3. So 3 would be a surprise roll of 4, and someone else gets a 1 or a 5 or a 2, etc. Okay, and then it says, assume the party of characters moving silently and invisibly comes upon a monster. They have a 4 in 6 chance to surprise, and the monster has a 2 in 6. A 6-sided die is rolled for the party and another for the monster. Both sides could be surprised, neither could be surprised, or either could be surprised. This is shown on the table below. And then they have this whole table of the party gets a 3 to a 6, the monster gets a 5 to a 6, and there's no surprise. Or the party gets a 1 and the monster gets a 1, they're both surprised. Party gets a 2, monster gets a 2, they're both surprised. Party gets a 1 or a 2, and the monster gets a 5 or a 6, the party is surprised. The party gets a 3 to a 6, the monster gets a 1 to a 4, and the monster is surprised. Party gets a 1, monster gets a 2 to a 4, the monster is surprised. The party gets a 2, monster gets a 1, the party is surprised. So it's just this long table here to explain surprise. I think it's really interesting. Out of all the things that he explains in here is surprise. Doesn't tell you how to hit your opponent. Okay, doesn't explain combat, but he tells you how to calculate surprise. Then he goes through traps, tricks, and encounters. And then he talks a little bit about it and what kind of encounters you might have. Again, these aren't really necessarily rules or changes or anything like that. It's more just like detail and explanations of things. Talks about communication, negotiation, combat. He talks about different things that can happen in combat, turning undead. And he says clerics are empowered with the ability to do this, but you're going to find out how they do that in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Magical control, spell combat, breath weapon attacks, magical device attacks, missile discharge, melee combat. Okay, so, but again, remember I talked about in the beginning, it's just these short, like just a few sentences for each. So, melee combat gets a little bit more, but like look at missile discharge. This aspect of combat includes catapult missiles, giant hurled rocks, the discharge of spikes from Manicor's tail, throwing such things as flasks of oil, torches, vials of holy water, bottles of poison, magic weapons such as javelins of lightning, fireball missiles from a necklace, etc., poison spitting, the hurling of axes, hammers, javelins, spears, etc., and shooting sling missiles, arrows, bolts, and so forth from slings and bows. That's what this section is. It's explaining what the term means, not how to execute it during a game. Okay, and then it gets into combat procedures, saving throw, and it tells you what a saving throw is, but again, not necessarily how to do it. The saving throw tables are not in the Player's Handbook, they're in the Dungeon Master's Guide. It tells you what armor class is, okay, all that kind of stuff. What is a first strike, weapon factors. Okay, so see, this is where it's going to start to explain weapon factors. You've already seen information regarding the damage each type of weapon does, how heavy each is, how long and how much space each needs, and the weapon's relative speed factor. The same charts also give the relative efficiency against armor types. Your referee will use these factors in determination of melee combat by relating them to his attack matrices. So that's all you're going to get, is this is what it is. The Dungeon Master will take care of it. You don't need to know how that works. Okay. Then you've got morale. You've got a lot on morale. You've got mapping. You've got organization, and then experience and what experience points are. So again, this is really nothing new. And then again, just the order of this: morale, mapping, organization, experience, and then poison. Not in the equipment section of poison, but it's over here, poison. And then successful adventures and what that means. Again, I'm not going to get into this because the intent of this is not what's in this book. It's more about how is this book different from what's in original D&D. All right, now we're going to get to the appendices. And this is psionics right here. And again, if you saw my video on Eldritch Wizardry, this is where psionics debuts. So the system of psionics and Eldritch Wizardry is confusing. It's cumbersome. It's not really necessarily detailed all that well, and a lot of people just don't like it at all anyway. More from a thematic standpoint than from a mechanic standpoint. Some people don't like it from both or either. This one's going to be different, but it's still similar. It's still way more complicated than it needs to be. So psionics are various powers derived from the brain, and they enable characters so endowed to perform in ways which resemble magical abilities. If your DM opts to include them, they will be determined for humans and possibly dwarves and halflings as follows. So in this game, elves, half-orcs, and gnomes cannot use psionics. So you have to have an unmodified intelligence, wisdom, or charisma score of 16 or higher to have psionic ability. And it's determined by rolling percentile dice. If you roll 100%, so you have a 1% chance to indicate that you have psionic ability. And then for each 1 point of intelligence above 16, you add 2.5 to your roll. For each 1 point of wisdom above 16, add 1.5 to your roll. And for each 1 point of charisma above 16, you add 0.5 point to your die roll. And you drop all fractions. So again, that is different from the way that it is calculated in here. Psionics. So you see, after all 6 normal ability categories have been rolled, the player has selected a character type. Player characters with unmodified scores of 15 or more in their intelligence, wisdom, or charisma may elect to check for psionic ability if they have opted to be human. So only humans can have it. Psionic ability is determined by rolling percentile dice. And in here, you have a 9% chance. A score of 91 or higher indicates the character has the ability. And so that's it. And then your ability changes a little bit based on like what your score is. So player characters advance in levels, normal, blah, blah, blah. And then bonus or penalty for a chance of gaining your psychic ability is a separate die roll. So you have a 9% chance here. In Advanced D&D, it's a 1% chance, but there's bonuses if you have high scores. It's still a less chance. It's most likely you're not going to have a great chance to do it. Okay, so, and then it gets into the psionic ability and the powers. The powers are like named exactly the same: Sonic Blast, Mind Thrust, Ego Whip, Insinuation, Psychic Crush. All that stuff is as it was in Eldritch Wizardry. The implementation's slightly different, but it's very, very similar. And then you have your different psionic disciplines. Now, as you might recall, in Eldritch Wizardry psionics, which is, it's not a core part of the game, but it was part of original D&D as far as a supplement. The psychic abilities that you could learn were dependent on what class you were. And in this version that Gary does here, that is not the case. So you just have all these different, you have minor and major abilities and that kind of thing, but they're not class dependent. Okay, and then the other thing you're going to get in here is bards. So I have a whole video on the history of bards. I run out of links that I can share up here at the top, but just go to I have a video on D&D class history, or a playlist on D&D class history, and you'll see videos for pretty much every class in there and where the class came from, why it was created, and how it's changed over time. So the bard also is going to debut in an issue of Strategic Review. Apologies, I forget the name of the author, but the author is thanked in that forward here at the beginning. But it was originally a standalone class, but it did have all these things like these different colleges, the different college that they might belong to, which is listed here. So Gary is going to change this and turn it into a dual class. And that's probably a good time to talk about this concept. So we are going to go back to the character classes to talk about something that you can do in this game that wasn't really necessarily all that well explained in original D&D, which is this idea of multi-classing. And what it means is that, your character is going to operate as two or more classes at the same time. It's going to give you very specific examples of what you can be. So you can't just be anything, but you can be a cleric fighter if you're a half elf or half orc. You can be a cleric fighter magic user if you're a cleric, if you're a half elf. You can be a cleric ranger if you're a half elf, a cleric magic user if you're a half elf, a cleric thief if you are a half orc. A cleric assassin, same thing, half orc. Fighter magic user is for elves and half elves. Fighter illusionist is for gnomes. Fighter thief is for pretty much any class, or any race, I should say, other than human. Fighter assassin is for half orcs. Fighter magic user thief is for elves and half elves. Magic user thief is also for elves and half elves, and then illusionist thief is for gnomes only. Now, why did I say except humans? Because humans can't multi-class. They are not allowed to. They have to do something called be a character with two classes, which is usually just called dual classing. But the idea here is that you're going to start as one class, and then as long as your ability scores are high enough in both your primary class and your secondary class, your second class that you're going to pick, you're going to eventually switch classes entirely and start over as a first level character with a new class. And then once you surpass the level that you were from the first class that you're in, then you get to combine the abilities for both. It's very clunky, very kind of pointless to have done it that way. I really don't understand what the point was in dividing it up that way. They're going to obviously do away with that in third edition and let humans multi-class. So I don't really see what the benefit was for a human, because humans are supposed to be getting benefits because they don't have the racial abilities of the demi-humans. But in this case, I feel like it's hampering them because it's not allowing them to multi-class. So the bard is essentially going to be a dual class, but it's really a triple class. So the way that Gary approaches it here, first off, they can be human or half elf. Okay, but Gary says, well, you start as a fighter, and then at a certain point, you're going to become a thief. And then at a certain point after that, you're going to become a druid. However, at that point, once you become a druid, you are now a bard, and you get all these new bard abilities stacked on top of the things that you've gained before as fighters and thieves, and the new abilities that you're gaining as druids. So bards were very, very powerful because they're getting the combination of 4 classes worth of abilities by only taking 3. They're also going to be very high level by the time that they hit that bard level, because they would have had gone through roughly about 5 levels each of fighter and thief before they even become a bard. So Why Gary did this that way, as opposed to letting them be standalone characters, I don't know. In Gary's notes for a second edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons that he was working on at the time that he was let go from TSR, or when he chose to leave after being forced out of his position, he was still on the board. But he decided to resign his position and leave. And no one can really blame him for that. But he mentioned as he was working on this that he was working on a version of the game and he was going to bring the bard in as a standalone regular character class. So even he must have thought that this didn't really work. One of the first things that you're going to see with the bard is articles in Dragon Magazine where people are going to be saying, here's how you can make the bard as a standalone class. So he has this table here of bards. So other than that, though, very, very similar. And again, see my video on the bard class because I'm going to talk about how it's different and how it's similar from the original incarnation. But, that is going to be a difference. And it's buried here in the appendix as opposed to in the core part of the book. All right, then you're going to get your character alignment graph here and all this stuff. So this is all kind of new stuff. But again, this is more like world building. And it's not really about rules. So again, I know that was a little bit long, but I think, the point here is trying to show how this game is changing and evolving over time. And when I say evolving, I don't necessarily mean getting better. I think there's an implication that that's what I mean when I say evolving. I mean, it's changing. So that's how I'm using it. It's changing. And Gary's changing things to make it more complex. He's adding layers of complexity, and he's also adding rules to try to, be available to help a DM adjudicate specific situations that are going to rise in the game. Original D&D is very much based on this idea that the rules are so flexible that they don't explain everything. And that's okay because every game's going to be different because the DM or the referee is going to make a ruling. And then that ruling is going to become how that table plays that game from that point forward. Advanced D&D is saying, no, we don't want to do that. We want every table to play the game the same way, which means we need to have a rule for everything that could come up during the game. Well, first off, that's impossible in a role-playing game because you can never anticipate what your players are going to come up with, or a clever DM as well. And but that was the intent of this, was to explain all these rules so that especially at conventions and in tournament play, a person could bring a character from another game that they had played in and show up and play that character and have the expectation that that character was going to operate the same way that they had used them in their home game. So that's one thing. And also so that all of the DMs that ran those games and then all of the judges who are awarding points are all coming at it from the same way and running things the same. Because if you're getting points for a game, but you've got two different DMs that are running things differently because they each have their own way of running things, that's not really fair to adjudicate. And so part of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons was very specifically to help have a standardized framework for how to run these tournament conventions so that people were gaining points on a equal level. Okay. So, and then again, I talked about it again at the beginning where, Advanced D&D is partially existing to help Gary make the case that this is a different game than this, and that Dave Arneson didn't work on this. This is all written by Gary, which is true. Gary does write these first three books himself. However, would he have written these by himself as they are in this format if this had not been published based on works that Dave Arneson had done? No. But Gary makes the case that this is a completely different game. It's advanced D&D, and that Dave Arneson should not get any royalties from this. Of course, the courts are going to find in Dave Arneson's favor later on, and Dave is going to get royalties from these books. But that's a whole other thing. So we're not really getting into that. But I hope that you enjoyed this video on the differences in the AD&D rules as we're starting to see them unfold. Now, the next video that I do in this series, not my next video that I'm going to publish, but my next video in this series on differences and additions will be about the rules in Dungeon Master's Guide. And this is where we're going to start to get some really nitty gritty stuff about, like, again, combat and things like that. So that is, again, going to wrap up this video. I do hope that you enjoyed it, and I would love to hear your comments below. I think there's a lot of people out there that still play Advanced Dungeons & Dragons First Edition, and I would love to hear from you guys on, things that you think I should have focused on in this. I obviously couldn't cover everything that's in this book that's different. I was trying to just kind of hit some highlights and talk about really sort of just the evolution and the change in the game over time. But definitely leave your comments below to let me know what you thought about this video, what you think about Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. and whether you prefer it still, or whether you prefer second edition, or whether you prefer fifth edition, or whatever it is. So I myself, as you guys know, prefer Moldvay Basic D&D, and especially I like the Old School Essentials version, and of Old School Essentials, I like their Advanced Fantasy, which takes all of the cool stuff from this, but puts it into like the classes and the races and the spells, but it put in the treasures, it puts it into the BX D&D framework, which for me mechanically I like a lot better. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, so leave them in the comments below. And then while you're down there, you can find places to join me on social media. I'm trying to be much more active on Blue Sky, so definitely check me out there. But I still have the legacy social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, that kind of thing. And also you'll find places where you can follow my blog, and you can support my channel. Two separate ways that you can do that right now. The two best ways would be first by visiting my shop to buy a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, or notebook, or other item featuring exclusive design that only I have available at my shop, and that are designed for tabletop role-playing gamers, or just, people who enjoy kind of this fantasy science fiction genre of entertainment. And so you'll find those designs there. And then also you can become a super fan. Just click on that heart icon with the $sign in it if you're able to contribute. I really appreciate everyone who's done so far. And I'm continually trying to upgrade my equipment here, get some better lighting. And I do need to buy that contraption that will attach my phone to this thing that my wife gave me for Christmas. It's like a table stand to put my phone on. And I'd like to make my lighting a little bit better. The light that I got for Christmas is not quite working the way I thought it might so far, so I need to figure that out. But all that money helps go back into the channel, and will also help me eventually go to more conventions and things like that, which I would love to, so I can see you guys in person. So make sure that if you're able to, again, visiting my shop or becoming a super fan are two great ways to help show your support. So that's going to wrap up this particular video. I think the next video, I'm probably going to talk about my house rules for the game that I run for my daughter and her friends, because a lot of people have asked for that. So again, I'm going to be weaving history into that as well, because I am running basic D&D from 1981, and so I'm going to be talking about that system and why I like it so much. I have talked a little bit about that before, and about the adventures that I'm running in there, and then some of my house rules. So please make sure to stay tuned for that. And until that video comes out, I'd like to thank you so much for watching this video. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I will talk to you next time. Okay, now for the bonus content. What I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. So I guess it's a little bit of a cheat, because I wasn't actually drinking this when I made my notes, but it is something I wanted to share with you guys now and show to you. So this, as you guys know from watching my videos recently, if you have seen them, today is March 17th, 2025. And my dad unexpectedly passed away almost 2 months ago, December 21st of 2025. And I'm still dealing with all the repercussions that come from that. My mom died a number of years ago, about 13 years ago or so. And or 12, I guess it's 12. And my dad did remarry, but his new wife, unfortunately, has advanced Alzheimer's and dementia. So I am now responsible for her care, as well as figuring out all the stuff for my dad. Anyway, I had to move my dad out of his apartment. I finally got that done last week. And one of the things that I found in his apartment was this. So this is a special bottle that he got. It's engraved. And it is a U.S. Navy. You can see my dad was in the Navy in 1960s, 60 to 64. So it says U.S.N. vet, U.S. Navy vet. And he was a radar man second class. And so it has that on there. And then he also had this matching glass that has his name. It's hard to see because the, there's nothing in here. But it has the U.S. Navy logo. And again, it says U.S. Navy vet, U.S.N. vet, and then radar man second class. So I thought this was really cool. So he had two of these glasses and he had this bottle. And the reason why it's a bit of a cheat is because He didn't have this bottle label, so I have no idea what's in here. And I thought it would be fun to kind of open it and maybe share it with you guys here on the channel because, many of you have been very, very kind to offer your condolences for my dad passing, which I super appreciate. So I try to get back to everybody as quickly as I can. I hope I didn't miss anybody who offered their condolences. And if I did, I'm so sorry. I've been a little bit overwhelmed. But again, thank you all for reaching out to leave a comment to let me know. I really appreciate it. So, so I thought, let's share this together and see if we can figure out what this is. So I'm going to give it a little smell here. Oh, yeah. I should have assumed because it's Navy, but this is rum. And I think I told you guys at some point before, I was shocked by how many different bottles of rum my dad had. I'm not a rum connoisseur by any means, so I can't really tell what kind this is. But anyway, cheers, anchors away. Yeah, it's definitely got that rum funkiness. It's a little light, actually. I don't know if this bottle came with something in it or if he, I don't think that it did. I think he bought it and then he decanted something into this bottle. Why he chose this particular one to put in here, I don't know. I guess he just really liked rum. He liked his tiki drinks, many of which are rum based. So, honestly, it's not very complex. It's got that sweetness to it, that rum sweetness. And again, like I said, that funk that's very characteristic of rum. So anyway, I thought that would be fun to kind of try with you guys. There's a little bit of spice in there, but it's not very overpowering. It's very light, I would say, light bodied even. But it's nice. It's nice to have this because again, it kind of reminds me of my dad, obviously. So thought you guys would enjoy that. Okay, and then the record, I know featured Aretha before. I did very early on. I did I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You, but now we have Aretha now. 1968. This is obviously a much later pressing. This is from Vinyl Me Please. And this is just such a classic record. So it's her 13th album overall, named by Rolling Stone as one of the top albums of the 1960s. And it's just a perfect album. There's no other way to put it. So it starts out with Think. Most people know that song. I Say a Little Prayer, which to me, this is the definitive version of the song. I know that Dionne Warwick also does a version of that. I think it's Dionne, but I prefer this one. You Send Me, Sam Cooke, classic song. You're a Sweet, Sweet Man. Hello, Sunshine. I Can't See Myself Leaving You. I mean, these are all just classic R&B songs and delivered in Aretha's just unmistakable singing style. So at certain points in time, Aretha has been named by Rolling Stone as the top singer of all time, or top female singer. I think it was just the top singer of all time in certain polls. It just kind of depends. Now, I've thought of this album. I do really like it, but my daughter's old kindergarten teacher from a long time ago, my daughter's 15 now. So her kindergarten teacher is someone that we've become friends with. And we invite her to our Christmas parties and things like that. So she has been teaching her students this month in February about all these like important sort of like Black musicians, African Americans. So, with jazz, blues, R&B, like sort of pioneers. And she was talking about sharing Aretha with her class. She was talking about it on Facebook, and I was like, "That's awesome!" And it just made me think, like, I need to listen to this album again. It's been a minute, and this is it's a really fun, good quality pressing. On this one's just on black vinyl. It's not colored vinyl like some of the VMP pressings are, but it's just a really good quality pressing. And again, it's just an album that I really, really enjoy. So definitely check this out. It's definitely guaranteed to put you in a happy mood. And, check out a song by, the Queen of Soul and see what you think of that. So I hope that you enjoy that. And thanks for sticking around for the bonus content. I want to call out somebody, and I'm sorry that I forget who it was, but somebody mentioned in the comments recently that when I started doing this bonus content that they never watched it because it doesn't interest them. And then they said that they started watching it as they got to be fans of the channel because they wanted to make sure that I was getting the full viewing experience. And so that algorithm was sensing that people were watching the video all the way through. So started watching the bonus content just for that purpose. And then from that, realized that they actually do like this content, and they said they're not really into jazz, and I know I do focus on a lot of jazz albums here, but it's made them interested to check out some of the albums and some of the drinks that I've talked about, the different beverages and things like that. And so to the person who said that, thank you, because that was sort of the intent of this whole thing. Partially it was just to give my channel a little bit of some personality, so it wasn't just hands and books all the time. It could be hands and drinks and records, I guess, but also to show you a little bit about my personality, and that I'm more than just a guy that likes to read old D&D books, that, there's more to me as a person. And, along the way, if you discover something that I really enjoy and I can turn you on to it, that is a bonus. And so I appreciate you for sticking around for that. And to you all for sticking through the bonus content. Thanks for watching. Cheers. And I'll talk to you next time.